to legacy. Our special guest today is Judy Tallwing, and she's an American Indian, and she has a background that's very exciting and interesting. And you're going to find out about it on Keepers of the Flame. Judy Tallwing, which tribe are you associated with?
Well, actually, Tallwing is a joke name.
Okay.
But I'm Indi, which is better known to some people as Apache San Carlos. My dad was from White Mountain Reservation. I'm also Tewa. My grandmother was Pueblo. So my great grandmother was an escaped slave. So I'm also black.
Oh my.
And I've got a little bit of Irish.
Irish black person. I love it. I understand that you have an exhibit at the American Visionary Art Museum.
Yeah.
How's that going?
Well, they own some of my work, and I donated it because I love the museum. My very first outing in Baltimore, the first time that I went to see anything or do anything, was friends were doing a tour of AVAM, and they said, "Judy, you got to come with us. You're going to love this." Because I was here because my friend was an artist, and he was sick, and he needed help. So I moved from Phoenix to here to be with him and help him. We were like brother and sister, and people used to think we were this cute little old couple, but we weren't a couple, and I made him afraid. No, I'm kidding, I'm kidding. But anyhow, so they took me to AVAM, and I fell in love with that museum. I saw the bra ball, and that was it. If any museum, because I've been in a lot of museums. When I was in the girls' school, there was a lady that used to come and visit, and she liked me, and she knew I was an artist, so she would take me out to see the art museums. But I had never been in one like AVAM. And the fact that none of the artists were trained, but they made you feel what they did. And that was something that I've always just admired beyond, because I paint stories, so, and they paint stories, they paint their stories, so you get to know that person. I love AVAM. And so I never thought, that was my very first place I ever visited in Baltimore. Because I will ever be pissed, that's the word, about how women on welfare are treated, and how wrong-minded every person I talked to was about who these women are and why they're there and why they're not off. Because I was there, I lived it, so it just, anyhow, that's one of my biggies. So I got elected to be a delegate to Houston. Well, I was also very pregnant and very sick. I didn't plan on being pregnant ever again, but I ended up getting very sick, and I was in the hospital over 8 months, like 8.5 months. They were keeping me and the baby alive. They kept wanting to abort the baby, and I kept saying, no, can't do it. Nope, 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 not doing it. So, and that's my choice. So, I was in the hospital. Well, I was in county hospital because if you had any brains at all, you never went to the Indian hospital then. Back in, no, nobody would go there. It was a horrible, county was so much better. And they were keeping me alive. But when I was they had the press come in and they had to clear them being able to come in and interview me at the hospital. But anyhow, I told my doctor I'm going to Houston, and he said, we can't be responsible for you if you do that. My advice is don't do it. I said, no, I'm going. I'm going to this. It's important, and I'm going there. So I said, you either give me my records, and I go with my records, and I'll make sure they know who I am, and this is what I need, or I'm going anyhow without them. So they did. They put together my medical records. And my mother, literally, my mother in going to Houston, who watched out for me, was Vera Brownstar. She was the tribal chair for the Yavapai Apache Nation, and she took care of me. But that started me on a path to changing. Well, I got to meet Gloria Steinem because she helped us stay up and write what the Native women are plank for the presentation for the plan of action, which was getting given to Congress and the President and the Smithsonian, and they all have those. So I got to meet these really cool women. My biggest regret from that conference was I never actually got to meet Barbara Jordan because she was my idol. But because of that, I got elected as a delegate to the mid-year convention, the National Democratic Convention that was held in Memphis, Tennessee. And I had my flight bag that had another era that was on it for ERA. I was active in NOW, and I was fighting like hell for us to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, and I was a prime leader in Arizona to do that kind of thing. And the governor at the time, Bruce Babbitt, was a friend from before my involvement in a lot of stuff, because he did a lot of work for the natives for free, for some of the tribes for free. But anyhow, so I had been given the right to speak, but the reason I wanted that one so bad, Joseph Califano was the head of the HW. There was also a young woman from Texas who, I can't remember her name, who started a whole ombudsman program to get people off of welfare into the community college systems. Well, I did that in Phoenix. And then I learned about her. So my whole point in going to Memphis for that conference was that particular, it's not a workshop, it's...
Seminar.
Yeah, it was one of the plenary sessions for setting the platform for president to run, because Carter was running again. And so I got to speak, but I got in line. It was this huge hall with the giant, curve that goes up forever, and then the big stage, and Joseph Califano, and there were other people up on that stage, and then you went down this kind of aisle, and there was microphone, and you had to be authorized to even get near that microphone, to stand in line even. So, but I had the right to speak thanks to Bella Abzug and Jane Westwood, who was the only woman at that time to chair the Democratic National Committee. So they set me up so I could do that talk. And so I'm in line. There was an older white woman with the silver blue tinted hair and she had diamonds all over her hands, and you could tell this was a wealthy woman, and she's in line, and she got up to speak, and she talked about women on welfare just having children because so they can get more money. Well, now I had dealt with enough idiots that thought that, but I was so angry. I said, rather loudly, "That's bullshit."
Mm-hmm.
And this little woman sitting next to me, she reaches up and she pats me on the arm, and she said, she said, "Come here, dear. Sit down next to me before you blow it. Just sit next to me." So I'm like so angry, and I said, okay, because I was quite a few people away yet. So I sat down next to her, and I was so angry. I'm looking at her, and I'm telling her all of these things. You realize $30 wouldn't even pay for the diapers that a baby needs. We didn't have Pampers then, and you can't even buy enough food for your baby for $30 a month. And anyhow, I was just going off, and the woman is patting me on the arm, and she's just patting me, and all the time I'm railing at her. I'm thinking, I know this woman. I've seen her before. Where did I see her? I've seen her before. And I really recognized her, but I couldn't remember. And then it hit me. And I went, "Oh my God, I just realized who you are." And she laughed. And she said, "You're going to be okay." She said, "And you're about ready to go up." She said, "It's okay." It was Shirley Chisholm.
Wow.
And she was sitting right at the edge. And I had seen her 2 days before on the congressional floor speaking. A friend of mine was a United Press International reporter, and she had me up in the up there, and I was getting to watch. It just like I was like, oh my God, look what I just did. So I'm kind of thrown. So I got up and I did my spiel, and I went back and I sat down, and she said, "That was well done. That was very well done." And she said, so we're sitting there, and she said, would you like to go on a little radio show with me when this is over? I have to do a radio show, and I would like it if you went with me. And I was floored. I said, yes, I would do that, yeah. She said, good. And so after the whole thing was over, we stood up, and she said, "But we have to go back up here." There was a whole bunch of people. It was that big hall, and it was back in a corner, and there were like 40 or 50 people up there. She said, "I have some people I have to talk to first. So do you mind coming with me?" I said, "No." And so I'm trailing along behind her. It was like, oh my God, because it's going through your head. But she was so nice. And we got up to that crowd, and as we're walking up, everybody turns around to look at her, and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we found the chair of our committee."
Wow.
She had them. I was the chair of the Welfare Reform Committee for establishing Carter's platform for re-election.
Wow.
I had to go back and forth. Well, the big meeting was at a hotel in Virginia, and that was because of her.
What a life.
And something else happened though. It's divine intervention. I have no question, because things happen. So we're having this big meeting, and I'm chairing, and I had a sergeant at arms. Thank you, my college, for having me learn Robert's Rules of Order. I still was a little shaky, but I had them. And I could see the room. It was a huge ballroom and literally was split in half. And there was a sticking point on the plank that this bunch they couldn't agree. They could not agree, and honestly, I was confused. I didn't know what the problem was. I couldn't see it. Usually when you're back up like that, you can kind of figure it out. And I couldn't see what they were fighting about. So I had the sergeant at arms call a recess. We called a recess. I had the lawyer from Philadelphia and the New York lobbyist, the woman who was a lobbyist from New York, come backstage. And we went back there and I said, okay, and this was my favorite word, whenever I had to do anything like Democratic National Committee, talking to the head of HEW, you know, like that, labor union, they sent me in there. But anytime I had to do that, I would say, well, I'm just a hick Indian from Arizona, you know, which was true. I mean, I was a hick Indian from Arizona. And so I said, I don't understand what the problem is here. So I said, what exactly do you want this to say? What do you want it to do? Don't tell me what you want it to say. Do it in plain language. What do you want it to do? And the lawyer spieled it out. And I looked at the woman from New York and I said, now, what do you want it to do? What is the problem? What do you want it to do? And she said, well, they weren't that far off. So I asked the secretary, I said, could I have a pencil and a piece of paper? And I'm looking for this. I want to get it because it's got to be in the archives somewhere, the National somewhere. I wrote it out. I wrote out a thing, and it was very simple language. Lobbyists, they don't know simple language. So I wrote it out, and I looked at it, and I said, can you agree with this? And he said, yes. So I asked her, I said, can you agree with this? She said, yes. I said, so why don't you just say that? And they looked at each other and agreed. They would say that. They would both accept that.
Wow.
And it went to the floor, and it went.
Wow.
And it wasn't the current Washington, because I made front page on that one a couple of times, but it wasn't that one. It was the one that has now defunct, but I know it's, and I keep intending to go and look it up, because that decision made front page.
All right, well, obviously your art is going to fit your lifestyle, the things that you've done and experienced. Tell us how all that weaves in together.
Well, because they're experiences that I've had, sometimes I see a picture. I'll remember something and I'll see a picture and I'm going to make it into a piece of art. The painting that's on, the big painting called A Prayer for Peace, that isn't current. I mean, it is current. That's the thing about it. It was because my daughter and I were watching a television. I was living with my kids then in Phoenix, and they were grown up, of course, and we were watching the TV, and a group of women from Africa, I'm trying to remember the country, I think it might have been Eritrea, but they decided that they needed peace, and to get peace it was going to take prayers, and lots of prayers. So their idea was that everybody who was watching this, everybody take the hand of someone next to them and keep doing that, whether you know them or not, so that they could create a circle of hands around the earth. And my daughter and I looked at each other and we held hands and we stood with the prayer, and I said, I don't have other hands to hold, but I've got an idea. So I went out and I staple my canvases on walls. My walls in the studio are full of holes because I stapled this big canvas up and I started painting. And it's a woman and she's like this and she's praying. There are over 2,000 prayers in that painting because that started something in my work. I would be working and I would hear something that had happened and I would put a dot, just a dot. I have my little bitty bottles that I make and I put a dot. So every time I hear that, I put a dot. I don't know what a lot of those prayers are, but at the time I do, and I add that prayer. So there are over 2,000 tiny little beads in that whole painting. And it's because I like working big. With my eyesight, it makes it easier. But so that was a piece. Anyhow, so the interesting thing was my friend Morgan Monceau is a well-known painter, and he was becoming pretty famous as he painted Black history. He was being inducted into the National Gallery, the Portrait Gallery Hall of Fame. He has 4 portraits that he painted. He did the presidents, George to George. But my favorite are the Black Cowboys and Indians, and the Diva series with the opera stars. But anyhow, this is my friend, and he's gone now, and I miss the rascal because we used to cause a ruckus here and there. And but his friend, Dudley Clendenin, collected Negram's art, and he had a special painting that he had gotten. Dudley came to talk to Negram about making sure, because I called him Negram, that's Morgan backwards, because I told him he always screwed things up. He was always going backwards, but it was our own joke. But Dudley came to the house to talk to Negram about coming to the unveiling, because they were doing a big ceremony and unveiling his art, his new piece of work. And Negram loved my art. I told him not to do it. Just don't be sure. I haven't shown in years. I had too many paintings stolen. I'm not doing that. But he did it anyhow. So Dudley came up to the studio, because I was painting. I called myself the Indian in the attic because there was no cupboards up there. I know I just told that story and it was really stupid, but it worked. Anyhow, I invited him up to the studio. Negram invited him and I invited him in, but he liked my work. And he was very, very sick. And so he and Rebecca were good friends, and he told Rebecca, what he did was he set us up to sit next to each other on a couch at his house for this unveiling. And we were talking, and I don't know nothing about, I had no idea who she was. I just liked her. She's just a really cool woman. And I think she's gorgeous, too. She's just beautiful. She's like sunshine. But anyhow, so we just talked. And she found out I was an artist. She asked me what I did, and I told her I paint stories. So not too long after that, she called me and asked if she could bring George, who was the man who fixed everything at AVM, if they could come to my studio to see my work. And they came to see, and I had a whole lot of paintings that I brought with me that were finished. I had about 6 or 7 paintings, but I was working on one called the Spirit Bears. And there's a print of that. It's a modified print, but of that one on display right now at Center Stage. They just opened the first Indigenous art gallery in Maryland. And so that piece is on display with a lot of other indigenous art that's really gorgeous work. Anyhow, so Rebecca and George came, and Rebecca said, we're having a show that I would very much like you to be a part of, and it was the storytelling, the art of storytelling, because that's what I do. And I said, wow. I basically said, sure. And so she had already seen them, and I told the stories of each of the pieces. And then she said, what about this one? And that was the Spirit Bearers. I said, well, it's not finished, you know, I'm still working on this. She said, asked me if I thought I could have it ready for the show. And I said, I'll sure try. But I know when she left that day, I was on cloud 9. It was like, oh my God, this incredible museum, and my work is going to be there. And so that was my first showing of my art in Baltimore, was at AVAM, and I managed to get the Spirit Bearers done, and they were still wet when I took them in.
Beautiful, beautiful. Wow, what a life. Judy Tallwing, you have one wonderful life, and you've shared so much of it with us on Keepers of the Flame, and you are a keeper of the flame. I just want to thank you for being a part of our show, and everybody, keep your eyes right here for the next edition of Keepers of the Flame. I'm John Carrington. This is Judy Tallwing, and we just want to say thank you and be a keeper of the flame.
Tell the stories.